guys, it's your boy Charlie Fish talking about NOS. All right, today we're going to be going over nitrous. I get tagged in a lot of posts and asked a lot of questions about nitrous. I sure have learned a lot over the years. I don't consider myself an expert, but I'll show you a little about what we do and show you how simple nitrous can be and how you use it. So when we're talking about nitrous, this is all for diesels. I don't do any gas nitrous. I've never done it. I understand the concepts of it, but if you're watching this video and you have a gas car, don't watch it. It's not going to be helpful for you. This is only for guys who want to run nitrous on their diesel trucks or diesel cars. So here we've got our Maximizer 5. We're actually running 2. You can mount them anywhere in the cab, under the hood. You can hide them. I like to see them because there's a little green light that comes on and lets you know that they're activated before you go down the track. All right, so first of all, let's go over the instructions. This can be really intimidating because there's a lot going on here. And when you get it and you see all the wiring, people get a little confused or intimidated by so much here. But the main basic components is on a diesel, you will only be running nitrous solenoids, not fuel solenoids. And this kind of shows fuel and nitrous solenoids. So just realize you're not going to be running any fuel solenoids or wet kits. So wet kit versus dry kit. A dry kit means you're spraying only nitrous. A wet kit means you're spraying nitrous and fuel. So the diesel, you don't need to spray the fuel. So the main components are, you're going to get your Nitrous Express Maximizer 5. You're going to have your solenoids, some relays, and some wires. Well, people get intimidated on, well, which wires do I need to hook up? Well, you've got your output 1 and 2, which go to your nitrous solenoid. You do have an output 3 and 4, but they cannot duty cycle a solenoid or pulse width or click it on and off. They can simply click a relay, which clicks it on, or you can buy an add-on that makes it so it can pulse width modulate the solenoids. But let's just talk about 2 jets for right now, or 2 solenoids. So you got solenoid 1 and you got solenoid 2. And you've got all these inputs. Mainly the ones that you are going to want to worry about are the ones that you're going to use. I recommend at least throttle position and tach, which is RPM. That will give you a lot of control over your tuning your nitrous to keep it safe. So you don't need Lambda, you don't need MAP. You can add it, they're great resources. It's not required. So as you go through this, don't get caught up on all the different, you don't need the N2O pressure, you don't need some of the analog ins, you don't need some of those other things that you might confuse you. To start off easy, do your grounds, do your arm switch, do your throttle position, and then do your RPMs. So how nitrous works, or at least this kit specifically, is the Maximizer 5 will ground the solenoids, and then your power switch will send power to the solenoids, whether it's through a relay or a switch panel, however you're going to do it. But when you arm your nitrous, it is sending power to the power side of the solenoids. And then the Maximizer 5 will duty cycle or pulse width modulate the ground side of the solenoid, and that's how it turns it on and off. No, blue is 1 and red is 2. But power would be here through these relays, and then green, I do the power. A little disclaimer, you do not have to wire it up this way. You can wire it up however you want. This is just how nitrous recommends it. The only thing you have to keep in mind is that the Nitrous Express is going to control the ground side of it, and you're going to send power through it. But you can send power through relays, power through solid state relays. I mean, I wouldn't recommend it. You could literally just run these to the battery. I wouldn't do that. I'm just saying there's lots of different ways to wire up your nitrous solenoids. All right, so we've got 2 solenoids right here. These are typically what come in a Maximizer 5 kit, or if you get their dual stage kit, they're 2 110 solenoids. So these are what are going to click on and off and pulse width modulate your nitrous if that's how you choose to run it. So these will typically run to what's called a nozzle. So you've got your solenoid and then a line running to your nozzle, and inside the nozzle you'll have your jet. People get confused. A jet is just simply there to restrict the amount of nitrous going through the nozzle. So this is a 136 jet, but it's only on a 110 solenoid, so that means it's only going to flow 110. You are limited by the solenoid side. So because this is the 110 solenoid, that means it can't flow any more than 0.11 thousandths of an inch diameter flow. So that's what that is. That's a 1.136 inches of diameter is the size of the jet. So if you put a 150 jet after a 110 solenoid, it's only going to flow 110. You can always make it smaller than the solenoid. You can't make it bigger than the solenoid. You can use the jets to size nitrous up or size it down. I always recommend starting with a smaller jet and then working your way up. It's always safer that way. But as you work your way up, it'll be more fun and you'll go way faster. When you install these nozzles, you want to make sure that the nozzle is pointed downstream. You'll see that there's one side of it that's open and one side of it that's closed. You do want the nozzle pointing downstream so it's spraying down and into the intake. So you've got your nitrous bottle, you've got your main feed line, and then your feed line will go to your nitrous jets. Most kits don't come with this, but I really like an on-off switch. It's just a valve to turn the nitrous on a lot quicker than the one on top. You know, you got to twist this 10 times and hold it all the way open. But when you close this, there'll be a bunch of nitrous in your line. And anytime you unhook it, you will lose all that nitrous. Well, if you put a shutoff valve right here, when you disconnect the nitrous bottle, now you only lose like about an inch worth of nitrous instead of 16 feet of nitrous line.
Is it important to tighten these clamps?
You're gonna wanna make sure these clamps are really tight before every race. You know, people like to walk by, look at them, loosen them, and if they loosen these clamps and you go down the track, they will fall off. And you will get disqualified and it will be embarrassing. I highly recommend securely fastening your nitrous bottles to make sure they don't fall off the truck before every run. So that main feed line from the tank comes up to a Y, and that Y feeds both of these solenoids, and these two solenoids are gonna go up to each one of these nozzles, and then you can adjust the jet sizing accordingly. I highly recommend putting a gauge on your bottle. Now, the gauge doesn't really tell you whether it's full or not. It'll tell you what pressure it's under. Even if your bottle's low and it's hot, it'll still be pressurized. So this isn't a full versus empty bottle. This is the pressure that you're at, and you do want it in the green. I like to be on the high side of green, maybe close to the red, because that's gonna be a consistent pressure. If you race one time in the yellow and next time in the red, the truck will run completely different because it's gonna change the pressure of the nitrous that's being injected. So try to be consistent. Hotter means higher pressure, colder means lower pressure. If you leave this out in the sun and it gets too hot, it can go into red and actually blow off the safety valve on here. So keep them cool, keep them in the green, but if it's too cold out, you might need to get a bottle heater or torch, or you can set it by an exhaust outlet or in front of a heater. You want to warm it up just enough so it's in the green, close to the red, just before you race. So the sky is the limit when it comes to nitrous on a diesel. And what I mean by that is we just went over a 2 solenoid setup. We actually have 6 solenoids on this, and they all do different things. We use some for spool up, some for launch, and we actually do have an AFR sensor on this, so we control our air to fuel ratio via nitrous. We're not going to go over that today, maybe in a later video, but it's really cool once you get into nitrous, all the different things that you can do and how you control it. This is just another way to show how a nitrous solenoid can be installed. There's no line in between the solenoid and the piping. On the other side of the truck, we do have lines running to it, but you can see that this solenoid is attached right to the pipe. There's nothing wrong with that. It makes it a little harder to change the jet in there if you need to, but you can mount your solenoids directly to your piping or your intake. So the jet side just refers to the inner diameter of the hole of the jet, and this will restrict nitrous. This allows it to flow more freely. So this is a 73 jet and a 136 jet. So the 70 versus the 140, let's just for easy math, that would be 100% bigger or twice as big. But that doesn't mean it flows twice as much. It's actually quadratically, so it goes up 4 times. If you are 100% bigger or double the size, it actually flows 4 times the nitrous. So a 50 jet versus a 100 jet is actually 400% more nitrous. So think about that when you're bumping up your jet size. It does go up more than exponentially. It goes up quadratically when you increase the inner diameter size. All right, so when you open up the Maximizer 5 program, I recommend updating your program, getting the newest download, and I also recommend updating your actual Maximizer controller. Make sure everything is up to date. So when you come in here, let's focus on the inputs first. This is where a lot of people get nervous and don't know what to do in here. And you don't have to use all of these, but at minimum, I highly recommend using RPMs and or TPS. So you need to make sure your RPMs are correct. It's very easy. You start it and then you literally just guess and check on these until the RPMs look correct. I can show you what that looks like. So that is correct. But if you were to change these, you see that's not correct. That's not correct. So you can just guess and check until your RPMs are reading correct at what the vehicle's reading. If the check box is on, that means it's enabled. If you don't want to use it, you can literally just click it off and then it stops working, or it won't use that. For the TPS, you also need to program it correctly. It's a little bit of guess and check on the voltage, but you can see we're around 0 now. And if I floor it, you'll see it goes up to 100%. So you can just guess and check on the voltage. You can look it up, because a lot of times it'll be in your owner's manual, or you can check the voltage with a voltmeter, but you just basically guess and check. So 0 is where it's letting off, and then 100% is when it's full. And you can see on mine, my voltage is backwards from what you might think. It is higher voltage at 0 TPS and lower voltage at full TPS. That doesn't mean every vehicle will be like that. And even on this vehicle, you can pick different wires that'll switch it. It doesn't really matter as long as it's reading correctly at 0% throttle and you see it go all the way up to 100% throttle. And then you don't have to use any of this other stuff if you don't want to. I do. I am using a map sensor. I have used a lambda sensor. You can base it off of speed and 2.0 pressure. There's so many things you can base it off of. But just for simplicity, let's start with TPS, or your throttle position sensor, your throttle, and then RPM. One of the reasons I like TPS is you don't want the nitrous on at 10% throttle. You only want it on under heavy load and higher boost. If you have it on under low boost and low RPMs and low throttle, it'll backfire, pop, shoot flames out the stack. I know that sounds cool, but you can literally explode your charge pipes, blow off your downpipe, and hurt your engine. So to start off safer, I always recommend only at wide open throttle or above like 3/4 throttle, maybe 50%, and then only at higher RPMs. And I'll show you how you can tune that. Let's jump into how you tune the jets or the solenoids. We're going to do output 1 and output 2 today. We generally went over how to plumb those in and how to wire them in. Now we're going to give you a general understanding of how you can tune them if you'd like. Let's go ahead and do RPM based tuning. And let's make our RPMs based off of peak torque and above. Now a 6-liter makes peak torque around 2,900 RPMs. Why I say to start there is if you spray before peak torque, it's really going to spike your torque. Torque is what breaks parts. It blows the tires off. You don't want a huge torque spike if you don't need it. So when you're just getting started and you want to be conservative, find out about where your vehicle makes peak torque, or the later after peak torque you spray, the safer. But if you keep a flat torque curve, it's less likely to break parts. You spray before peak torque, you're going to have a spike in torque. So 6-liter makes it 2,900 RPMs. Let's start ramping it in there. I like to start at about 20% duty cycle, because anything below 20%, sometimes the solenoids don't actually click on and off. A lot of people say start your duty cycle at 20% when you want it to actually fire. You got 0 to 100%. That just means 0 is less duty cycle, 100% it's fully on, or it'll be fully open. Anything in between, it's going to be clicking the solenoid or cycling the solenoid. So let's say you shift at 4,000 RPMs, 4,500, you can type that in at the end. So that means anything above 4,500, nitrous will be off. Anything below 2,900, nitrous will be off. And then you can just play with this ramp. I recommend not being too aggressive at first. You can always add more nitrous later, but the second you blow up your truck, your day's over. So I recommend starting a little later and then go down the track, see how it feels. Everything looks good, your back pressure is not too high, your boost isn't too high. You can start bumping these up and changing the graph. You know, the smaller the jet you have, the more aggressive you can be in this. I would not throw in a 136 jet for the first time running it and then turn this fully on and then just have it on the whole time. That's not where I recommend you start. You might end up here because you might realize everything's safe, you're not having any problems, you don't have any traction problems, you turn it up. But there's lots of different ways you can do it. You start at 0 and go to full. You can have it, you know, decide, okay, over 4,000 RPMs, I want all the nitrous on. You know, you're just gonna play with this a little bit. Same thing with jet number 2. You can do different things with different jets, but some people will ramp in one jet and have the other jet kick on. Let's say this is a smaller jet and you ramp it on really quick because it's just a 52 jet and it's gonna help you just get out of the hole a little quicker. Then maybe this one comes on at 2,900, goes to 5,000, reset to straight line. Maybe your next jet kicks in a little less aggressively. You play around with it, you can change it. Now, some people like to have time-based. There's a lot of advantages to time-based. For example, you could make both of these time-based, and then this is just time. Let's say you're running in the quarter mile, you want this higher, in the 1/8 mile, you want it less. Let's say you have a goal of a 670, you know, that's 6.7 seconds. You want your nitrous to spray for maybe 7 to 8 seconds. your goal is a 670. You know, you could have it a little more, maybe 7 or maybe 8, just in case you're afraid you're going to be kind of slow. And then what would you do for time? Well, what some people do is they don't want to spray during their 60 foot because it tends to blow their tires off. So find out, let's say you have a 1.6 60 foot, you could have it ramp in after 1.6 seconds, or slowly ramp it in during the 60 foot. And then you could have your next jet, time base, kick on. Let's make it full, reset. So let's say you want this jet to be fully on by 2.4 seconds, and then the next jet to kick on at just after that. The advantage to time base is it's actually coming on as you're going down the track. Some people will add 1, 2, 3, 4 jets, and they'll have them kick on at different stages down the track. Because if you kick in the nitrous too soon when you're launching, it'll just blow your tires off. So you got to slowly ramp in the nitrous over time. But that's really hard to do with RPMs, because a lot of people, once you get launched, you're basically at full RPMs and you'll be at full nitrous the whole rest of the way down the track. So it can be hard to control. The advantage of nitrous is that you can ramp it in at lower RPMs. So even when you shift, let's say you shift at 4,800 and then it drops back to 29, it's going to turn the nitrous off and then ramp it back in, thus keeping your peak torque down again. On time base, you can't really do that. So there's a lot of safety parameters you can put in. You can go to your inputs and make sure that on your TPS, it's only above 80% throttle. So if you lose traction, you chop the throttle and get back into it, it'll restart the nitrous. If it's on a timer, it restarts the timer. If it's on the RPMs, it'll go right back to the RPM chart. For simplicity, for newbies, I recommend RPMs. Don't be too aggressive. Start off slow and work your way up. All right, so a lot of guys get worried about how much is too much nitrous. And there's 3 indicators that I like to go over. First of all, you should know generally how much power you can make on your truck. If your rod's only rated for 600 horsepower and you're spraying the thing to the moon, you're probably gonna bend a rod. There's no gauge you can stick on there to know that. Know how much power you can make, generally start approaching that power limit, and don't spray past it unless you're willing to break parts. But other than power, on a diesel, you don't really have to worry about air to fuel ratio too much. On a gasser, the reason they run a wet kit is they have a really fine window of how much air to fuel they can run. With a diesel, you can run much leaner and much richer than a gas truck. But I know you don't have an AFR gauge. Maybe you're gonna get one someday. I'm gonna show you what it looks like on an AFR gauge. So when you look at this graph right here, this line right here is gonna be your EGTs, and then this is your AFR. And you start seeing smoke, or the smoke starts to clear up at about 16 or 18 to 1. By the time you get to 20 to 1, it's running pretty clean, but you can go all the way up to 28 to 1 and have 0 smoke, and your EGTs actually go down. So most trucks, most race trucks, everything you're running right now is going to be around 14, maybe 16 to 1. That's typically what you'll see. And at first, when you start to spray, you'll notice your EGTs go up, and that gets really scary at first. Well, as your EGTs go up, the smoke goes away, and about the time the smoke starts to disappear, you will have reached peak EGTs. Well, you also don't want to spray too lean. I know I said we have a wider window, but the window of the gasser is about as wide as my finger here. But on a diesel truck, you can run it from 10 to 1 all the way to 28 to 1 and have no problems. So how do you know if you're approaching 28 to 1 if you don't have an AFR gauge? Well, you can look at your EGTs. That's one indicator. So where the smoke starts to disappear will be the highest the EGTs will ever be. As you spray past that, you'll notice your EGTs starting to go down. Typically at the worst spot possible, you'll approach 2,000 degrees EGTs. You probably think your truck's running pretty clean, probably doesn't have a lot of smoke. You probably think you're spraying a lot of nitrous, but if you're at 2,000 degrees EGTs, you've got a long ways to go. You can spray all the way down to 15, maybe even 1,400 degrees. So I know that's not an AFR gauge, but it gives you a general idea. If you're still at 17, 18, 1900 EGTs, you can still spray a lot more nitrous. As you spray more nitrous past the smoke limit, when your truck starts going on the track looking like stock and you see no smoke and you start spraying more nitrous, you'll see it starting to clean up a little bit more. So those 3 indicators: 1, the limit of your parts. Don't spray past the limit of your parts. Generally know where your horsepower is, and know that if you're making 600 horsepower fuel only, you'll be able to spray that up to 7, 8, 9, even 1,000 horsepower on the same amount of fuel. So keep on the limit of your parts. Second, watch your EGTs. As your EGTs start to go down, you start seeing, if you were at 2000, it starts going down, you see more around 18, 17, 16, 15. As you approach 1500 degrees, you're starting to be a lot safer on the engine, but you are approaching the AFR limit. If you go too lean, you can actually lean it out and it'll backfire and pop on you if you push it too hard. So if you have an AFR gauge, try to keep it between 22 and 26, maybe 27, 28 to 1. Try not to go past 28 to 1 unless you're willing to push those limits. With EGTs, if you're still above 1500 degrees, you can probably spray a lot more nitrous. Another reason you don't spray nitrous down low is you need that heat in the cylinder to keep everything going. If your intake air temps are low and your RPMs are low and your boost is low and you spray a bunch of nitrous, it will backfire and pop on you. You need some heat in the intake, you need a little bit of boost, and you gotta have enough fueling to keep it going. On a diesel, it's literally called putting the fire out. It'll literally cough, backfire, and shoot white smoke out the exhaust. So as you're getting into this, spray it later, spray it under high boost and under heavy load, and then work your way back. So I was asked to make a special part of this on how to use nitrous to spool up your turbos. Let's say you're running a big single and you just can't get it going on the foot brake, or if you do, you're burning your trans to the ground while doing it. Nitrous is a great option to spool up big single turbos. You can get it lit quicker at the line, you don't burn down your other competitor, and you don't put as much strain on your transmission, your converter. So what that would look like is a lot of people will put a button on the steering wheel. Now remember, the Maximizer 5 controls the ground side of the solenoid. You control the power side of the solenoid. Some people use that in an arming switch, but your arming switch can be a button on the steering wheel. So when you press the button on the steering wheel, it clicks on a relay which sends power to the power side of the solenoid. And then that jet will only be on when you're pressing that button. So let's say on the foot brake, you press the brake, you press the throttle, you get to 1600 RPMs, nothing happens. Well, what you can do is come in here to the RPMs, start it at 1600 and ramp it to full. This is just a spool jet, so you don't need it going down the track. The smaller this graph is, the more resolution you get. Let's say you launch at 2900 RPMs and you're only using this jet to launch. Well, you can literally use this to spool a turbo, and you want to be really conservative, because if you spray too much nitrous that low, it'll backfire and pop. So you can start at 20% at 1600, 20% at 1700, 20 at 1800, and then as the turbos start to come alive, you can ramp it in. Play with these things every time you go to the track. If it's cold out, you'll need to be less aggressive. If it's hot out, you can be more aggressive. But this is a great tool to spool your turbo up at the line. You get up to the line, you press your foot brake or your trans brake, you press into the throttle, you get the heat up a little bit, you get to 1600 RPMs, and when you press the nitrous button, it'll come up much quicker. I recommend keeping these jets very small. I'm talking a 28, 30, or 40 jet. 52 at the max, but a lot of people with the 52 will pop or backfire. This is a great option to get your turbo spooling faster at the line if you want to run a big single and you don't want to run a really high stall converter. All right, so where do you want to put your nozzles or your jets? We get asked that question a lot. It comes down to personal preference, but the closer to your intake manifold, the quicker and more aggressive it's going to be. It just takes less time to travel from here to here than it would be to go all the way through the intercooler. So a disadvantage to spraying it here is it's more likely to pop and it's more likely to backfire. If you're just getting started, I like to spray just after the intercooler or just before the intercooler. It just gives it more time to dissipate, more time to cool down the air charge and to go into the intake. But there is a delay. We've measured it before. For the nitrous to get from here all the way to the engine can take up to 0.3 seconds. And you wouldn't think that matters, but if you need a quick response or if you're launching or using it for anything like that, then the closer to the intake, the better. But if you spray it before the intercooler, you get kind of a two-stage cooling effect. You know the nitrous is going to be evenly distributed amongst all the air when it goes into the engine. Now, I like to spray before the turbo. It gives a great cooling effect to the air going into the turbo, and then it has time to dissipate all throughout the piping and the intercooler. I recommend spreading your jets out. You can put one before the turbo, one after the turbo. If you're going to run 3, you can do one before, one after the turbo, and then one after the intercooler. But spreading them out allows it to cool down the air in different passes. The bigger jets, I recommend putting much farther back. Smaller jets, you can probably put closer up. If your jets are close up to the intake manifold and it's popping or backfiring, you can try moving it back or putting it before the intercooler, and it'll help reduce that. All right, well there you guys go. I was asked to make a little video on nitrous, generally how to run it for a couple of newbies or even people that want to learn more. They've been doing it for years. If you have any questions, post it up in the comments. We might make a follow-up video on how to use an AFR gauge to control your nitrous or even how to use traction control to control your nitrous.